The purpose of UW Alacrity Center version 1 was to improve the usability of evidence-based psychosocial interventions for underserved communities, primarily focused on non-mental health settings, with primary care being the main setting followed by schools. We wanted to test whether methods from human-centered design could improve the usability and uptake of these interventions.
So the rationale for the focus on psychosocial interventions in these settings is that there have been decades of writings and work demonstrating that frontline clinicians have a very hard time using evidence-based practices such as cognitive behavioral therapy, problem-solving treatment, behavioral activation, and this was the impetus for the center of why I wanted to focus on this was based on an Institute of Medicine report that I had, work group report that I had worked on, that really was trying to identify what the reasons why these evidence-based treatments, where we have a ton of evidence from science showing that they're effective in different communities, but when it came to implementing them, there's very little uptake. And it's particularly bad in non-mental health settings, and that and it's very hard to train certain types of providers in these evidence-based practices, because they're not in their home training programs, not trained already in how to do these interventions. There's a lot of limited infrastructure for these evidence-based treatments, educational programs. Really, across the board, there's a lot of variability in terms of if you go to one graduate program, whether or not you're going to ever be exposed to an evidence-based practice. And that even though training programs tend to be credentialed either by the National Association for Social Work or the American Psychological Association or what have you, those credentialing practices don't really reinforce or enforce that students in their programs have to learn these evidence-based practices. It's sort of up to the program based on their philosophy. Licensure doesn't assess for competencies. So, pretty sure this is true for social work, but I do know for a fact in psychology, nobody sits us down and watches us do an evidence-based treatment with a patient to assess our ability to do those practices. The competencies that we have to pass have very little to do with our knowledge and our ability to implement these interventions. Ongoing, and there's a lot of variability between states. So when I was in California, that was when I went for my licensure there. I actually did have to do an oral exam, but the oral exam was mostly focused on interpreting psychological assessment data, which is, I won't even go into that. And in New York, but at the same time in New York State, you had to submit audio tapes of yourself doing therapy with patients. But whether you got licensed or not depended on who was listening to your tape, whether they were psychodynamic, cognitive behaviorally oriented, or whatever. And you could literally fail if you didn't get the right examiner. So states have a lot of variability in how they, assess your ability to be a clinical psychologist. Ongoing quality assessment is limited to continuing education credits. Anybody who is a practicing clinician will know that the existence of your license is based on whether or not you paid a bunch of money to sit through classes that vary from everything from like ethical practice, all the way to certain specific types of interventions, but there's a very little oversight as to the quality of those continuing education credits. And all you have to do at the end of those sessions to get the credits is be there at the end and to complete a learning objectives kind of quiz that's literally very easy to pass. Then when you even if you could address training, licensure, and continuing education, billing codes for psychosocial treatments are generic. I had a chance to look into this recently. It's very interesting. There is a specific billing code for psychoanalysis, but beyond that, there's no separate billing code for CBT. There's no separate billing code for anything else. And in talking to some of my colleagues in the UK, they were asking, the reason why I was delving into this is they were asking me, how do we bill for psychological services here in the United States? And when I told them how we do it, it's literally based on the amount of time you sit in front of a patient. They said, oh, that's what we used to do back 15 years ago, and that things have really changed since they restructured how they support psychological treatments in the United Kingdom. So there's not a whole lot of incentive and for providers to learn evidence-based treatments nor to deliver them. Another big challenge is that even if they were incentivized, either by their organization to learn an evidence-based practice, a lot of these interventions that we developed were not developed in the context in which we're trying to use them. So for instance, in schools and primary care medicine, those are very different settings than private practice, where a lot of evidence-based practices like cognitive behavioral therapy were developed. And so it really influences, the usability of the intervention if you start to implement it in settings that they were not designed for. And so this is just the definition of usability, that it's the quality of users' experience when interacting with a product or a system. And it's about the effectiveness, efficiency, and overall satisfaction by the user. So in our experience, what influences usability are things like intervention complexity. The more things you have to do and the more decisions you have to make when you're implementing an intervention, the harder it is to actually use it. There's also learnability. Is it something you can use right out of the box? Or like a lot of our evidence-based treatments, you have to undergo an awful lot of training in order to learn how to use the intervention. So that influences its usability. There's also the degree to which an intervention is error tolerant. So and most clinicians in the front line, major complaints about evidence-based practices is that they don't see them as being very flexible. And so if you're with a patient that doesn't look like the ideal patient that you were trained on, maybe, they have a much harder time being flexible with the therapeutic elements in an evidence-based treatment, again, influencing its usability. There's also the degree to which it's engaging. Some of my experience in training clinicians in problem-solving treatment is that it's a very tedious intervention for them, that if they're seeing 20 patients a day and each session is like, let's define the problem, let's come up with alternative solutions, let's make a decision and come up with an action plan. I've had clinicians tell me that they just won't do it because it is exhausting to do the same thing every hour for 5 days a week, and they just want some flexibility to do something a little bit more engaging with their patients. There's also concern about whether or not the interventions really match the goals of the patient and the clinician who's using them. And then there's obviously the contextual fit, to the degree to which somebody can actually use the intervention in the time that they have with the patient, in the setting in which they're seeing the patient in, and then the patient's usability context as well, whether or not they have the bandwidth to do something like regular assessments every day of their mood, or homework assignments when they're dealing with all sorts of other things or demands that they may have on their plate. So our approach in the center was to test whether or not we could use human-centered design to really solve these usability challenges. And essentially, we were interested in, whether or not we could go beyond what we've been doing with community-based participatory research, which is largely about asking and talking to people about what their experience is with these interventions, and moving much more into like watching what happens when they try to use the intervention, getting their feedback about what the intervention challenges are, as well as what solutions they may have to improve the usability of the intervention. And I'll just kind of blow through this really quickly, but there are a lot of different methods that we wanted to engage in, such as A/B. I don't know that we did that much A/B testing or card sorting, but we did a lot of active inquiry, such as cognitive walkthroughs or thinking aloud. We did a lot of observational inquiry, watching people use evidence-based practices or tools. And concept mapping was something also that we had used, as well as participatory design. So for instance, really sitting down with the intended end user, and often it was a clinician, sometimes a clinician and patient dyads, to really get a sense of where the sticking points were with implementing an intervention and what suggestions they had for improving its usability. In our intent was to test this new model of intervention redesign called the DDBT model, Discover, Design, Build, and Test. And in the discovery phase is when you identify what the usability challenges are. Design and build was the co-design process we used with clinicians and patients to improve the intervention or the implementation strategy, because we did have some examples of that in the first 4 years. And then to test the effectiveness of that redesigned intervention or strategy. Our main aim was to reduce the number of reactive adaptations clinicians tend to make to evidence-based practices when they're in front of a patient, and being much more proactive about the adaptation, anticipating, all of the potential challenges that happen when you're implementing an evidence-based treatment before they actually happen, in the moment. So that you can never really get rid of reactive adaptation, but you can minimize the number and scope of the reactive adaptations if you think proactively about what needs to happen to the intervention to fit your context. So just really quickly, our center was structured in this way. Technically we had 3 cores, but they're really 2. There's an administrative core and the methods core. And then the research core consisted of 3 R34 level proposal studies and 12 RO3 level awards. We had advisory boards. We both had, clinician advisory boards. So these were mostly people in primary care medicine who had been interested in implementing psychosocial treatments in their settings. We also had an outside advisory board that consisted of people in policy, so American Psychological Association, National Association for Social Workers, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance that did a lot of peer training, as well as people who've done a lot of work around implementation of psychosocial interventions in low resource settings, as well as implementation science. We built a website that you probably are all familiar with by now, and we created a design team to help the R34s and the RO3 level awards, use these human-centered design strategies to improve psychosocial interventions or the implementation strategies. So I'm going to talk about the administrative core, and the purpose of the administrative core was to support the RO3 awards and other junior faculty in submitting proposals to NIH and NSF, National Science Foundation, to develop the website and educational materials to help support both clinicians and settings in using human-centered design strategies to improve their interventions, and then to develop external cross-disciplinary advisory boards, basically the advisory boards that I was just talking about, and their role was to evaluate our center progress. So our outcomes were really great in terms of supporting multidisciplinary teams and the use of our adaptation framework. We very successful that in partnering not just internally here at the University of Washington, but externally, worked with other investigators to use DDBT. We had 39 grant awards, 49 publications, 41 presentations. And one of the things that NIMH wanted us to do was to collaborate with other alacrity centers. And so we established 3 collaborations, one with Cornell, the Impact Center at Kaiser, and the center at the university at Northwestern University. We funded 12 RO3 level research projects led by multidisciplinary teams. And then from those projects, there were 20 publications from the RO3s. And as you can see from this graphic, we were truly multidisciplinary. Some of our big partners were from nursing. Obviously we're very, psychiatry centric, but, we also worked with speech and hearing, health services, education, and so forth. We had a strong emphasis on diversity and equity. And from the past 5 years, 7 investigators that we funded from the RO3s were for underrepresented, backgrounds. So we had, I don't know the specific demographics, but many women, Asian women, Hispanic, and I think maybe, I don't know if we had any African Americans, but we could look into that. Our research team had at least one principal investigator who was a person of color. And of those, they had received 8 new grants based on their center-funded work. 5 were from NIMH, 1 from NCI, 1 from NIDA, and 1 from the VA. And they published at least 6 peer-review articles. In terms of our website and educational materials, our website had a lot of traffic. We provide a lot of information on the use of the DDBT framework. We've had almost 18,000 views since June of, that's 2022, so we probably have had more since then. I'm sorry, that's 2020, not 2022. We have 16 educational videos that are open access. Anybody can watch them. And those videos have amassed about 850 views, with the most popular being how to do remote research, designing an intelligent tutoring system, contextual inquiries, and introduction to the DDBT model. And to address key issues during COVID, we produced 2 highly viewed sessions with over 500 participants at each session on remote design and remote research methods to help pilot projects and R03 projects operate effectively under those restrictions. We met regularly with our advisory boards, 2 of them once a year. And our research advisors were people like Enola Proctor, Jeannie Miranda, Frank Degree, and Shannon Wesley Sturman. Our guild's representatives from the APA are listed here. We had APA, NASW, primary care medicine, and Depression Bipolar Support Alliance. And then we had our clinician representatives were all from the WPRN, which is the WWAMI Practice Research Network. So now I'll pass this over to the methods core, and I will just drive for you. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Pat. All right, so we'll go on to the next slide. So we had 2 key goals in the methods core. One was to support all of the R03 and R34 teams that Pat just mentioned in applying this new DDBT model, and making sure that they had the support to think through the right methods choices and also to carry them out as they did them. And then also to conduct center level science that would investigate the usability of existing interventions and implementation strategies, and also start understanding what patterns of redesigns could address each of the kinds of usability issues that we saw in the center projects. So we had a set of recommended quantitative measures to try and support the teams, which also served our center science goals. So it was a little bit of like, here's some measures that we think might be helpful for you, and we know they're helpful for us. And then a framework for analyzing and reporting usability issues, so that as teams went through their interview transcripts or observations or things that they saw, they could start understanding what about the existing intervention or implementation strategy is turning out to not be so usable for clinicians or recipients. And then mentors for each project team, as well as dedicated expert support in user experience research and user experience design. So Emily and Alex, and I want to just take a moment to thank them, because I felt like in many ways, Emily and Alex were the band-aids or the glue that we threw in to, oh no, we didn't really design enough other supports, so here's Emily or Alex and they'll help talk through it and do the work with you and just sit down and really support it. So you two were amazing, and I think so critical for the success of the first round from the methods perspective. All right, next slide. So in terms of center science, the first thing we published, and actually I think one of the most cited things from the center so far, is the protocol paper that described what we were trying to do here with the center overall, what the DDBT model was, what some of the supports were, and what some of the questions were that we were going to look at as we looked across all of the things that the individual teams were finding. Go on to the next one. And then so as we started to look at the results, we started to say, okay, what are, across all of these R03s and all of these R34s, what are the kinds of usability issues that we see coming up across projects over and over and over that seem to keep an intervention from working in these non-specialty settings where so many people prefer to access care, what are the things that keep implementation strategies from succeeding or taking hold? And so we came up with 13 usability issue categories, but I'm actually more excited about the heuristics we proposed for intervention and implementation design teams to keep in mind as they develop and deploy interventions for kind of guiding, how do we make this usable, right? So are we thinking about the infrastructure that's there? Are we designing according to that rather than imagining infrastructure that doesn't exist? Are we making sure that the intervention or the way it's introduced demonstrates the value and builds buy-in as things go forward? And so I think that this paper is actually really, I'm biased because we wrote it, but I think this is a really nice reference for teams as they think about either understanding why an intervention or an implementation strategy isn't succeeding, or even more importantly, for designing things that do succeed. Cool. All right, and this is backed up with a quantitative scale of, or a quantitative study of the intervention usability scale that looks at existing EVPIs and asks the question of, are they usable? And in particular, this focus on motivational interviewing, and kind of consistent with a lot of the reasoning that motivated the center. The answer is, yeah, they do have a ways to go if these interventions are going to be used in non-specialty settings. Thanks. And next we'll turn it over to Aaron and Mike to talk about some upcoming papers. So I think Mike's up first.
Yeah, sure. So one of the papers that we're working on right now is looking at one of the primary questions from the first round of funding, which is whether or not the DBT actually had an impact on acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, and usability. So you can see a little taste of our response to that question on the right-hand side. If this looks like a meta-analysis type of figure, well, that's because it sort of is. Essentially, this is just showing from 4 projects the effect sizes across the IAM, which is the appropriateness measure, the FIM, the feasibility measure, and the acceptability measure. And we also have in some of these the IUS, the usability scale. And these are effect sizes from phase 1, discover, to design, build. And so like for project 4, which is the top project, you can see that they had an effect size of about 1 for appropriateness, meaning that between phase 1 and phase 2, user ratings of appropriateness grew by about 1 standard deviation. You can see pretty broad whiskers on there, though. That's our standard error. And we have large standard errors because all these projects were quite small, which is one of the reasons why we're putting this into the meta-analysis. One other thing you can see is that these scores tend to cluster together in terms of the change over time. So for project 4, we had a lot of improvement. For project 2, we had a lot of improvement. For project 3, it was pretty neutral. And for project 1, it looked like it was actually going in the other direction. In terms of maybe the scores were getting a little bit worse after design build, which can make sense because in the discovery process, sometimes people were being asked what an intervention or an implementation might look like, and there may be sort of these projections about this kind of fantasy of what things might be in the future versus how they may actually look when you're actually doing the design build process. Another thing I think that is kind of interesting here is that we do see, again, that the different projects have these different ratings. So while they're correlated together, we can see that there's probably some moderators going on. And just like any meta-analysis, those moderators are probably associated with the methods, the specific methods that they used, the types of participants, their actual approach to using DDBT, the type of intervention, the type of implementation strategy, et cetera, et cetera. I see there's a couple of chats in there. Ian asks, are these R34s or R03s? But these are R34s. And yeah, so this is just a taste. We're working on a broader paper that'll have all of our projects in there. And we also have data from phase 2 to phase 3, from design build to the test phase, which is maybe actually the more interesting question to ask. We're also working on a second paper or a third paper right now around qualitative, doing some qualitative work where we're mapping the actual adaptations or the redesigns that were performed to the specific usability issues that Sean just described in the categories. And we're pulling these categories from the framework for the modification and adaptations. and ideally going to be aligning some of this mapping with the with the specific interventions and implementation strategies that people used.
All right. The other thing that we really sought to do is to build capacity beyond kind of the immediate goals of our center projects. So that includes boot camp. Katie has been amazing at organizing, keeping us all coordinated to pull it together, with support for both our RO3 project teams as they look ahead to the next grants, as well as F&K awardees who are seeking to apply the GDBT model in their own research. We've also been really happy to be able to organize 2 workshops that were a bit more externally oriented, one at CERC and one at an HCI conference that started thinking really about this question of how do human-centered design and implementation science fit together? What are their complementary strengths? How can they perhaps each address some of each other's weaknesses? And starting to ask these questions beyond the boundaries of our center, but with a new and an emerging set of communities.
All right, and now this is mine, I think. And as we sort of head into sort of thinking about and planning for and executing what we're doing and what we're referring to as UW Alacrity 2.0, I just want to thank Pat for your leadership throughout 1.0, being the sort of sole PI and then sort of sharing the spotlight a little in the later years with me as we now transition into an updated leadership structure. And we wouldn't be here without your leadership, and it's fantastic to be able to build on it. And I just want to add, so exciting to see so many people on the line hearing about what we've been doing, both people from the original 1.0 phase and people who have sort of joined us in preparation and now going forth into 2.0. So it's a nice opportunity to kind of bring some people together from both phases and some people who will be continuing with us. That's really exciting for all of us. So the overarching goal of 2.0 is not entirely dissimilar from 1.0. We plan to use a multidisciplinary innovative design methodology to address the challenges of effectively implementing evidence-based CI clinical intervention. That's sort of how we framed it in the grant, and IS implementation strategies in low-resourced, underserved communities. And as we'll talk about in the next few slides, this reflects some of the growth and some of the evolution of different parts of what we're doing in the center that Pat and Sean were sort of, and Mike were hinting at as we sort of moved to even a clearer understanding and articulation of what it is and what we're going to be doing as we go forth. So there's a lot of similarities to 1.0. This is not an exhaustive list, but we're of course going to continue to leverage human-centered design methods and integrate these with implementation science. First thing I always say about the Alacrity Center, and the first thing I'm going to keep saying is when I describe it, is that the Alacrity Center sits at the intersection of human-centered design and implementation science, first and foremost. And that's certainly where we hope to continue to have our scientific impact. And we're also going to, those sort of broader, sort of center-wide scientific goals that Sean was talking about and Mike was laying out some initial findings surrounding as well. We're going to continue to collect cross-project indicators of success, indicators of usability and things like that, recognizing that we have some large projects, larger than 1.0 in 2.0, and still some smaller and pilot projects, and we're going to be continuing to leverage that to be able to do some integrated data analysis. So things that are more new in 2.0, updated leadership roles, we were already talking about that, also some continued leadership roles. We're also explicitly broadening our target population and setting. So we sort of went from at least our primary thrust from when we started in 1.0 in primary care to this more sort of expansive consideration of integrated non-specialty care settings. And more than anything, that to us, and it doesn't have to be fully limited to this, but these accessible settings are very frequently primary care for adults and schools for kids, really, and our projects aren't entirely limited to those. We're not anticipating that all of the R03 style projects that we wind up doling out are going to be just in one setting or another, but those sort of represent what we're after, these accessible, community-based, often settings for the delivery of mental health services to adults and youth, respectively. We've also gone from what had been a sort of articulated focus on depression to a broader internalizing and externalizing sort of focus, recognizing that those are a lot of the things and not necessarily just limited to one particular problem domain that some of these integrated non-specialty care settings are trying to grapple with. And if you do mental health work in schools, you know that it's hardly limited to depression or depression and anxiety. Students have an array of issues and experiences that might require support. We've also gone more explicitly, and we've been talking about this all along, but we've sort of made it official in a lot of ways in 2.0, from focusing on interventions to recognizing that sometimes people and projects are redesigning particular interventions that may be client-facing, but sometimes they're focusing on implementation strategies and redesigning that strategy while leaving the intervention relatively intact. And we're being very explicit about that in how we think about the UW Alacrity Center 2.0. There's also number 4, which I think is particularly important. And we're really trying to make a deliberate shift from centralized design experience, sort of relying so much on our Emilys and our Alexes, to trying to get some Emilys and Alexes out in people's lives, out with their research teams and in their communities, and sort of shifting to ways we can even more explicitly support local redesign teams to be able to do even more of this work and do it in an engaged way with different constituents and people in the settings where they're doing their work. And we've also done some revision and I think clear specification of what we think our redesign mechanisms are. What are the processes that we're hypothesizing across projects are going to make a redesigned intervention something that's easier to implement. And if we go to the next slide, you can see them laid out here in sort of our, it's essentially our UW Alacrity Center theory of change, where we have an original intervention or strategy, our DDBT process, and then our 3 core mechanisms of change for why we think DDBT is having an impact. Some of these are unchanged from the last time around, and some of them are new or differently articulated. But we have improved usability, we've already been talking about that. Improved engagement and user engagement in a way where we're trying to draw from some, I think, emerging or more modern conceptualizations of engagement within human-centered design that's really thinking about the quality of engagement, not just the quantity, not just more is better, you should always be engaging with an intervention or an app or anything like that, but recognizing that there are different qualities of engagement, and that may be even more important. And focusing on this contextual appropriateness, because so much of the work that we do is about taking an intervention or sometimes a strategy that's shown to be effective somewhere and then putting it somewhere else through this process. And through it, we have our redesign strategies, our implementation outcomes, and I might call your attention to the bottom one, where we've been even clearer about what Pat was talking about at the outset, that we're trying to decrease, recognizing reactive adaptations are going to happen, but seeing if we can decrease them through this prospective and deliberate process. And then ultimately, of course, getting to the clinical outcomes that we are most interested in. So we can just keep going through those boxes. And I just want to run through some of the aims of both our admin and methods cores, and then we could open it up, I think, to a little discussion or reflection or things like that before we're done for today. So our admin core has a lot of kind of consistent focus and then sort of elaborated focus relative to where we were in 1.0. First aim is to facilitate translational research on the use of DDBT and the redesign of clinical interventions and implementation strategies in primary care and schools, to foster synergy between research disciplines that are participating and the different cores that we have, continuing to hopefully have as good a track record for pulling in multiple departments and disciplines in the ways that were displayed in that in the figure with the overlapping sort of circles that Pat was showing. Supporting our pilot projects, we're continuing to have our pilot project program that was really focused on a successful NIH-based selection process that was really driven by John Fortney, and we're lucky to have him continuing with us to be able to keep having such a successful pilot program that I think really did a good job of mirroring a lot of the NIH review process. Also supporting early career investigators through Team Science and our Grant Writers Bootcamp. And that Grant Writers Bootcamp, I think, has been pretty successful and been a nice way to support both the use of our methods and to support early career investigators in trying to get some successful funding for their important work. The admin core is also dedicated to evaluating our overall center progress to meet our goals and sort of collecting that information and disseminating information about it, both disseminating our activities, our findings, and our products through places like our website. And then the methods core. One of the things that we have the ability to do now in the methods core is to build on some of the things that we sort of were able to first begin to shape in 1.0. We have our typology of modification targets. Those are sort of the usability issues that Sean was talking about that we turned into some of our heuristics. And we're going to be continuing to augment that and build on it and refine it as we go forward. We're also expanding the library of redesign solutions, one of those papers that's in progress that Mike was talking about, where we've mapped some of the redesign solutions teams have come up with to the frame. And we're going to be able to continue to build that out and to continue to determine what seem to be the most effective sort of local redesign decisions and solutions that teams are coming up with in order to address our mechanisms of change. And then also to really be able to test the extent to which across projects, redesign improves our DDBT mechanisms. So we're doing this across multiple methods. We have both self-report and observational approaches to evaluating each of those mechanisms, right? Usability, engagement, appropriateness. And we're also going to be able to compare the extent to which the unadapted sort of original version of the intervention or strategy versus the prospectively redesigned is going to be adapted further and gather information about those sort of reactive adaptations that happen once something's deployed to the real world. And we'll be collecting costs of DDBT-driven redesign to inform dissemination and to see sort of what does it take to do this sort of work using these kinds of methods. This is just an overview of the projects that we have coming up in 2.0, some of which are starting more or less immediately and some of which have a bit of a delayed start. Our largest project, our R01 project, is focused on problem-solving treatment. And it's led by Ian Bennett and Sean Munson and Patrick Raue. And it's getting started now. And this project is really a continuation of one of the R34. So we have some of that continuity, both in terms of the work that's going on and the setting of focus. So this is one is going to be explicitly focused on primary care settings and adults. The other three of these R34 projects are focused on schools and are going to be sort of showcasing that maybe more recent explicit focus of what we're doing in the UW Alacrity Center. There's a project led by Jill Locke and Karen Bears that's going to be focused on building an implementation strategy surrounding a school-based intervention that they've been revising that was actually connected to one of our R03 projects back in 1.0. There's another project that I'm leading with others, including Denise Walker, that's going to be redesigning trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for delivery in schools by people like school counselors. There's a project led by Eric Bruns, Jenna Van Dren, and Elizabeth McCauley, that's going to be redesigning an implementation strategy to support the delivery of a brief intervention for school clinicians. That sort of also fits a bit within the school version of a multi-tiered sort of service delivery framework, where there's some sort of triaging related to level of need and responsiveness to intervention. All of these projects are going to continue to collect shared outcomes, our mechanisms of redesign, as well as implementation outcomes and client reported outcomes, allowing us to continue to pull together our information and learn things across the center that are greater than the sum of its parts.